Welcome back, or welcome to Sage in the Sky. I'm Carrie, and if you've been here for a while, you'll know that the shadow is territory we return to often in this space. It's at the heart of almost everything I do. The readings, the writing, the work I hold with women who are standing at crossroads in their lives. The shadow is rarely far from the conversation. So when I say we're going there again today, I want to be clear about why. Not because I've run out of other places to go, but because I think there's a layer of this I haven't quite named before. Or I may have named it, but I feel it deserves more discussion. It's something I've been circling in my own work lately that feels important enough to bring here. Because here's what I keep noticing, both in myself and in the women I work with. Even those of us who are familiar with shadow work, who have read about it, who have sat with it, who know the language and the concepts, even we can carry a subtle, unexamined assumption about what the shadow actually is. That it's essentially a holding place for the difficult things, the anger, the fear, the shame, the parts of us we'd rather not claim. And yes, some of those things live there, absolutely. But I think that framing, even when it's held gently and without judgment, is only half the picture. And the half we're missing might be the most important half of all. Because here's what I've come to believe, both from years of working in this space and from my own experience of this path. The shadow isn't only where our most difficult self lives, it's also where your truest self has been waiting. And that changes everything. Let me start with Carl Jung, because this is his territory and he deserves proper credit. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist, a student of Freud who eventually went his own way, and his work on the unconscious is some of the most important psychological thinking of the 20th century. If you've ever heard terms like the collective unconscious, archetypes, or the anima and animus, that's Jung. The shadow is one of his central concepts, and it's simpler than people often make it sound. The shadow in Jung's understanding is everything that lives outside the light of our conscious awareness. Everything we can't see about ourselves, or more accurately, everything we've chosen at some point not to see. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume the shadow is essentially a rubbish bin, a place where all the bad stuff goes, the anger, the jealousy, the selfishness, the fear. And yes, some of those things do live there. But that's not the whole picture, not even close. The shadow also holds what Jung called the golden shadow, the unlived potential, the suppressed creativity, the parts of ourselves we set aside not because they were bad, but because at some point we learned they weren't acceptable. They were too much, too loud, too ambitious, too strange, too sensitive, too wanting. Think about that for a moment. Think about the messages most of us received growing up, explicitly or implicitly, about which parts of us were welcome and which weren't. You're too much. You're too sensitive. Who do you think you are? Don't get above yourself. You need to be more practical. You can't make a living doing that. Oh, stop being so dramatic. That was one that I heard a lot of and still do to this day. Now, those messages didn't make those parts of us disappear. They just taught us to hide them. And so we did. We became very good over many years at presenting the version of ourselves that was acceptable to our families, our schools, our relationships, our workplaces. We became excellent at knowing which parts to bring out and which parts to keep quietly out of sight. And we called that growing up. But here's what I want you to hear today. Those parts didn't go anywhere. They went underground. And they've been there ever since. Patient, quiet, waiting. Sometimes sending up small signals in the form of inexplicable sadness or sudden anger or the persistent feeling that there's something you're supposed to be doing that you're not doing, or the strange grief of watching someone else live a version of the life you told yourself you didn't want. The shadow isn't your enemy, it's the part of you still waiting to be claimed. I want to take a moment to be specific because I think abstract psychology only gets us so far. For the women I work with, women who are navigating transitions, standing at crossroads, feeling that persistent restlessness that sleep doesn't fix. When we start doing shadow work together, what do we find? Sometimes, yes, we do find the difficult things, the anger that never got expressed, the grief that was never allowed, the fear that got dismissed as weakness, the resentment that felt too dangerous to admit. Those things are real and they matter and we work with them. But more often than people expect, what we find in the shadow is this: self-trust, desire, authority, the part of her that knows, the part that has known for some time what needs to change, what no longer fits, what she would choose if she let herself choose freely. That knowing didn't disappear. She just learned somewhere along the way that acting on it would cost something, would disappoint someone, break something, require a courage she wasn't sure she had. And so she pushed it down, and she kept pushing it down. And eventually it became something she couldn't quite hear anymore. A voice she'd gotten very good at talking over. The shadow for many of us isn't where our weakness lives. It's where our strength went when we decided it was safer not to use it. And shadow work, real shadow work, is the process of going back for it. Not to punish yourself for leaving it behind, not to wallow in what was lost, but to retrieve it, to bring it home, to say, I see you, I know what you are, I'm not afraid of you anymore. Because here's what Jung's successors discovered when they began working with people through this process. When the shadow starts to integrate, when those hidden parts start to come back into relationship with the conscious self, something remarkable happens. The Jungian literature describes it as a revival of hopes, or more beautifully than that, the return of the feeling of living one's own life. I've read that phrase many times and it still lands the same way every time. The return of the feeling of living your own life. If that's not what you're looking for, I'm not sure what is. Now, I would love to tell you a story now, because this is what I do. I reach for the old stories when the modern language runs out. And this one I think says something about the shadow that no amount of psychological explanation quite manages. We're going to Glamis Castle, Angus, Scotland. One of the oldest and most storied castles in the country. A place layered in history and legend and a particular kind of atmospheric Highland unease. Glamis has a secret, or rather, Glamis has a room. The story goes like this. Somewhere within the thick stone walls of Glamis Castle, there is a room that doesn't quite appear on any official plan. A chamber that was, at some point in the castle's long history, sealed up, walled in, removed from the architecture as thoroughly as it could be removed, which is to say, imperfectly. Because walls can be built around a room, but the room itself remains. Now, the stories vary about what that room contains, and I'll leave the specific details to your imagination, because the specifics matter less than the shape of the thing. What matters is this. Something happened. Something was known, and the knowing was too much. Too shameful, too dangerous, too threatening to the carefully constructed image of the family and the castle and the life built around it. And so instead of facing it, they did something else entirely. They built a wall. They redesigned the floor plan. They told everyone, including eventually themselves, that the room didn't exist. And life continued, the castle stood, the family carried on. And generation after generation lived their lives inside those walls, navigating carefully around a space they had agreed not to acknowledge. There's another Glamis legend, older, darker, of a man who made a reckless bargain, who found himself sealed into a room with the consequences of his own choices, the door bricked up around him, the game continuing in the dark. He didn't disappear. The room didn't disappear. The castle was simply redesigned around the refusal to look. Now, I'm not telling you this story to be dramatic. I'm telling you this story because I think most of us have a room. Not in a castle, but in ourselves. A space that contains something we decided at some point we couldn't afford to look at. Something we felt but didn't say. Something we knew but didn't act on. Something we wanted but learned to be ashamed of wanting. Something that happened that we never fully processed, never fully grieved, never gave the acknowledgement it deserved. And so we did what humans do. We built a wall. We redesigned the floor plan of our lives around it. We got very good at navigating around this space without ever acknowledging it was there. And we called that coping. And it is coping. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to shame anyone for the walls they've built. Walls serve a purpose. They are seasons when we cannot afford to open certain rooms, and the building of a wall is an act of survival, not failure. But here's what I would like you to consider. Some of you have been living around that room for a long time now. And somewhere in your body, in the quiet moments, in the 3 a.m. wakefulness, in the persistent feeling that something is slightly off about the life you're living, somewhere you know it's still there. Shadow work isn't about taking a sledgehammer to the wall. It's about finding the door, opening it slowly, bringing a light, and discovering, as most people do discover when they finally look, that what's inside isn't the monster they were afraid of. It's a room that has been waiting patiently for someone to finally come. So let me be direct with you now. Shadow work is not an excavation of your worst self. It is an act of retrieval. The creativity that get called impractical, the anger that get called difficult, the desire that get called selfish, the ambition that get called unrealistic, the sensitivity that get called weakness, the knowing that get called naive, the voice that get called too much. Those aren't your failures. Those are the contents of the room. And here's what I would like you to understand about information, because that's what the shadow holds at its core. Information. Data about who you actually are, what you actually need, what you actually want, what has actually hurt you, and what you are actually capable of. When we suppress that information, when we wall up the room and navigate around it, we don't just lose access to the difficult feelings, we lose access to everything the shadow holds. The creativity, the intuition, the self-trust, the aliveness. There is a particular kind of flatness that descends when we've been living around our shadow for a long time. A sense of going through the motions, of being competent, functional, fine, but not quite present, not quite living from the inside out. That flatness isn't depression necessarily, though it can become that. It's the cost of keeping the room sealed. And the return, when it comes, when integration begins, is exactly what the Jungian literature describes. A revival of hopes. The return of the feeling of living your own life. Not perfection, not the end of difficulty, not a life suddenly without shadow, but the return of aliveness, of being present to yourself, of making decisions from a place of genuine knowing rather than from fear of what's in the room. That is what is possible, and it begins not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a question, a simple, honest question. What have I been not looking at? I want to leave you with something practical today, because I know that episodes like this one can feel illuminating and also slightly overwhelming, like someone has handed you a lantern and pointed you toward a very large, dark hallway. So let me make it smaller. Shadow work doesn't begin with a ritual or a dramatic ceremony or a deep dive into your most painful memories. It begins with curiosity, just curiosity, the willingness to ask, gently and without judgment, a few honest questions. And here are 3 that I'd invite you to sit with this week. The first, what am I consistently not looking at? Not what you're afraid of in some abstract sense, but specifically, concretely, what do you navigate around in your life? What topics do you shut down quickly in your own mind? What feelings do you reach for the phone to avoid? What conversations have you been putting off for months or years? The pattern of your avoidance is a map. It points fairly reliably toward the room. The second, what do I feel when I imagine actually having what I say I want? This one is subtle, but it's powerful. Most of us have things we say we want: the relationship, the work, the life, the change. But if you sit quietly with the image of actually having it, and you notice what arises, not the excitement, but underneath the excitement, what's there? Fear, guilt, a sense of not deserving it, a quiet conviction that it would cost too much. That undercurrent is shadow material. It's information about what's sitting between you and the thing you say you want. The third, what gets dismissed in me before it even reaches the surface? This is the question I find most useful for the women I work with, because often the shadow operates at the level of preemption. We've become so practiced at suppressing certain parts of ourselves that they don't even fully form before we've already shut them down. The impulse to speak that gets swallowed before the words arrive. The desire that gets labelled unrealistic before it's even examined. The anger that gets reframed as tiredness before it can name itself. What are you dismissing in yourself before it even gets a chance to exist? Sit with one of those questions this week, just one, and you don't have to answer it completely. You don't have to do anything with the answer. Just let the question be present and see what it stirs. And if you'd like something more structured to work with, I created a resource called At the Threshold for exactly this beginning. It's a self-guided collection of shadow work prompts, reflections and practices for women who want to start this work privately at their own pace without overwhelm. It's £11 and it's in the show notes. I would like to end with something small, a ritual of sorts, though it barely deserves that word. It's simply this. Tonight or this week, a moment when you have a little quiet, sit down somewhere you won't be interrupted. Put your hand on your chest, over your heart. Breathe slowly a few times until you feel the busy surface part of your mind settle slightly. And then ask yourself, as honestly and as gently as you can, what have I been calling fear that might actually be knowledge? Write whatever arrives. Don't edit it. Don't explain it. Don't try to make it useful or coherent or ready for anyone else's eyes. Just let it be there. That's the beginning, not a confrontation, not a reckoning, just a door open to crack and a light held steady. As always, thank you so much for being here. This work matters, yours and mine both, and I don't take lightly the trust you place in turning up to listen each week. If this episode resonated, I'd be so grateful if you shared it with someone who might need it or left a review. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. The links for At the Threshold and the Founders Grove are in the show notes, along with the sign up for Lantern Letters, my weekly reflection sent every Sunday for navigating exactly this kind of inner threshold. And until next time, take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the shadows.